Hi, everybody. This lecture is on the neurology of the normal swallow. And I will just begin by sharing the slides. And make it big. There we go. So the neurological basis of deglutition, and you know what deglutition is now, so we're set with that term. The central control. Now we're going to talk about the central control and then the peripheral nerves that are involved with it. But as far as the central control goes, there are two parts to the central control. One is in the brainstem, and it's referred to as the brainstem swallowing center. And the other is in the cerebral cortex, just in front of the motor strip, the head area of the motor strip. And that is Brodmann's area 44-45. That part controls the oral phase. The brainstem controls the pharyngeal and esophageal phases. Brodmann's area 44-45 should be pretty familiar to you. That's Broca's area if you're talking about 44-45 on the dominant side of the cerebral hemispheres. Now, going back to the brainstem swallowing center, it is located in the rostral medulla. Keep in mind the medulla is the very base of the brainstem. And the rostral portion of the medulla would be the one that is more up toward the head end of the structure, brain, as opposed to the tail end, which would be the caudal medulla. This is the rostral medulla, about the rostral rostralmost 1/3 of the medulla. And the brainstem swallowing center involves three structures. One is the nucleus solitarius, which is afferent in nature. It receives information from the periphery, basically from the pharynx. And the other is efferent in nature. That's the nucleus ambiguus. Nucleus solitarius, afferent, nucleus ambiguus, efferent, and then the surrounding reticular formation. Together, those structures form a hardwired circuitry. Now, what I mean by hardwired is you're born with it. In fact, you have it quite a bit before birth, already wired up to control and produce a pharyngeal swallow response. That's right. Infants well before birth do have a pharyngeal swallow response, and we can see it in sonograms, the infant swallowing amniotic fluid and generating all the expected movements of the structures as you went through them. And so it's hardwired. It's essentially, it's a little computer that will receive input from the 9th cranial nerve into the nucleus solitarius and then generate a sequence of motor commands that you studied in the last lecture involving movements of the velum, the pharynx, the closure of the larynx, the opening of the UES, all of that. Is the result of motor commands going to the muscles that are involved in a certain sequence and in a certain pattern. So that is the brainstem swallowing center. And then the oral phase is under your voluntary control. You don't necessarily think about it, but you can. You can, for example, you can hold a bolus in your mouth as long as you like, and then swallow it when you want to. Typically, we do it automatically, which is not the same thing as what is done at the brainstem swallowing center. That you have no control over. Once you have generated the start of a pharyngeal swallow response, you have no control over it. You can't stop it midway. But in the oral phase, controlled by Brodmann's area 44-45, on both sides, by the way, not just one side, you can control it any way you want to. But it does happen automatically. You don't have to think about it. All right, now, let's look at the structures and where they are. This is a view of the brainstem. And up here is the rostral end of the brainstem. Down here is the caudal end of the brainstem. And in fact, it goes down into the spinal cord. The actual brainstem stops right about here. In other words, this is the medulla, and right around here is the end of the medulla and the start of the spinal cord. This is the two halves of the thalamus. This is the midbrain. This is a representation of the pons from the upper side. This is the floor of the fourth ventricle. These are the three peduncles that attach the cerebellum to the brainstem, to the pons essentially, mostly to the pons. This is the middle cerebellar peduncle, the superior cerebellar peduncle, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now, I'm telling you that not to, because it has much to do with swallowing, it doesn't, but just simply to orient you to the brainstem swallowing center and how it is located and positioned with respect to other brainstem structures. So now we're going to come down here to the medulla. And the way this particular illustration works is to show you in red the nuclei that are motor in nature, and in blue, the nuclei that are sensory or afferent in nature. So you do have both of those on both sides, but they have, in order to simplify the illustration, just showing the motor on your left and the sensory on your right. Now we're going to focus in on two of the nuclei, the nucleus ambiguus shown right here, and it does run the length of the medulla. That's how I know that the medulla ends about here. In this somewhat out of proportion brainstem, it's a little out of proportion, but it works for us. Pardon, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, here we go again. Okay, and then on the other side, shown in blue, is the nucleus solitarius. This is labeled nucleus of the solitary tract. I'm not going to go into an explanation of why they chose to use that term, but it is the nucleus solitarius, and most people refer to it as such. So here it is. Both of them are cylindrical in their shape. Both of them are nuclei, meaning they are collections of cell bodies of neurons within the central nervous system. That is the definition of a nucleus, and when we're talking about neuroanatomy. All right, now let's go on to the next illustration, which is the nucleus solitarius. Well, I kind of jumped ahead and showed it to you, but here it is, nucleus solitarius. Now we're going to look at those nuclei and the nerves that they attach to from the lateral view. So this is a lateral view of the same things that we were looking at before. We don't have the diencephalon or a thalamus shown here, but this is midbrain. This would be, just to orient you, the aqueduct of Sylvius, which is that part of the ventricular system that passes through this little channel in the midbrain, the part that's so vulnerable to brain injury, and we'll get into that later when we get to etiologies. Here's the floor of the fourth ventricle, which you saw in the previous illustrations. The pons is up here, and they're trying to show a little bit, excuse me, I didn't mean pons, I meant cerebellum. They're trying to show here cerebellar tissue, but the actual cerebellum itself would be quite large like this, and that obviously is not depicted fully here. And then since we're looking at red structures here, and that's how this set of slides is showing motor versus sensory, or efferent versus afferent, is red is efferent. So we're going to focus in on this nucleus, which is the nucleus ambiguus. See, pointing right to it, nucleus ambiguus. And then the nerves are the 9th and the 10th, the vagus nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve. I just want to make a note, I want to put the glossopharyngeal nerve to bed. As far as motor functioning goes, it controls just one little muscle of swallowing, the stylopharyngeus, which you cannot differentially test. I mean, if there's something went wrong with your stylopharyngeus, we're not going to be able to test it. So essentially, we can say that all of the muscles involved in swallowing at the pharyngeal level and the esophageal level are controlled by the nucleus ambiguus. So here it lists them. It says cranial nerve 10 provides efferent output from the nucleus ambiguus to the muscles of the pharynx. And I could put here velum, the velar muscles, the pharyngeal muscles, the intrinsic laryngeal muscles, and the upper esophageal muscles. So those are all the muscles, except for the stylopharyngeus, involved in the entire pharyngeal phase of the swallow. And then the upper esophagus. Now, the lower esophagus is controlled by a different brainstem nucleus. And so we'll get to that later, but it's essentially, it's out of our scope of practice to get much into the esophagus. That's the territory of the gastroenterologist, a physician who specializes in the digestive tract. So we're not going to study the esophagus in a lot of detail, but we are studying the pharynx in a lot of detail, as you can see. Okay, so here we have a depiction of the nucleus ambiguus giving rise to neurons for the 10th cranial nerve, and then our little footnote, the glossopharyngeal stylopharyngeus muscle. I just want to remind you something you probably know, but some people may still be a little unclear about what's involved at the neuronal level here. The nucleus ambiguus is a collection of cell bodies of motor neurons whose axons form the 10th cranial nerve, much of the 10th cranial nerve, the motor part of the 10th cranial nerve. And so those axons are going to go out to those muscles that we have listed up here: velar, pharyngeal, intrinsic laryngeal, and upper esophageal. That's what's going on there. The nucleus has the cell bodies, and the nerves have the axons. They go to the muscles. In the case of the efferent, they go to the muscles and make them contract. All right, going on. Now we're going to look at the glossopharyngeal. Now, I had said that the motor part of the glossopharyngeal is not very important. The sensory part is. Your entire pharynx has obviously sensory endings that are going to react to material. Like when you transfer something from your mouth into the pharynx, there's got to be a reaction. That afferent component is carried by the glossopharyngeal nerve. So while the glossopharyngeal nerve is not very important from a motor perspective as far as swallowing is concerned, it's incredibly important from an afferent perspective. So it carries all of the information back from the pharynx to the brainstem swallowing center, and specifically to the nucleus solitarius. From the pharynx, here's an important kind of landmark: posterior to the oropharyngeal port. So if you go anterior to the oropharyngeal port, you're in the mouth, and that's a different cranial nerve that provides sensation for that. That's also important for swallowing, but not for the pharyngeal and esophageal phase. All right. Now, this illustration is a cross-section through the medulla, and specifically the rostral medulla, where the brainstem swallowing center is located. So we get to see the same structures we've just gone through in the last 4 slides, but just from a different perspective to see how they're interconnected a bit. First of all, let's find the nucleus ambiguus. That is the red nucleus just to the left of where you see the number 11. Now, here's the number 11. Here's the red nucleus. This series of slides is showing, this series of slides is showing motor system in red, sensory system in blue. So here's the nucleus ambiguus. And here are the neurons that make up number 10, the vagus nerve. Number 9 that's not the number of the cranial nerve. It's a number of a coding system that is used here, but I'm only showing certain things. So I'm showing the nucleus ambiguus, and I'm showing the axons that give rise to number 10. I'm sorry, that keeps skipping. My mouse is very sensitive. Okay, so that's one thing, nucleus ambiguus. Then nucleus solitarius is this one, number 9. Here's nucleus solitarius. Keep in mind it's sensory, so it's shown in blue. And then here are the neurons that are attached to that. This would be the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve has receptors out in the various areas of the pharynx, and they're carrying afferent information back to the nucleus solitarius, where they synapse on cell bodies. The dendrites are cell bodies, most likely. And so the cell bodies here are not first order motor neurons, they're second order sensory neurons, or second order afferent neurons. So in terms of the location, here's our nucleus ambiguus, here's our nucleus solitarius. And then the reticular formation, which is the third component of the brainstem swallowing center is just represented by this speckled area around here. And you can see it's kind of nebulous. It doesn't have a real specific boundary like the nucleus ambiguous, very specific boundary. Reticular formation, not as much. It's just a core of interconnected neurons, which run basically the length of the brainstem at the core, or not out toward the edge, but at the core. And overall, I should make just a comment about the reticular formation if you're not aware. You probably are. That it's associated with, among other things, the sleep-wake cycle. Part of it helps put you to sleep, and part of it helps wake you up. It reacts in response to sensory stimuli coming in. I mean, so basically, if you are asleep and there's a loud sound, hopefully you wake up, and the way that happens is your auditory system brings it in, reticular formation gets the message and sort of alerts the whole thing and wakes you up. But in this case, this particular part of it has a different function involved in swallowing. So you take those three components and wire them up in a certain way, and you've got a little computer which will receive the input of afferent input from just behind the oropharyngeal port through the 9th cranial nerve and set into motion a set of motor commands carried by the vagus nerve to the muscles involved in the pharyngeal and the esophageal portion of the swallow. All right, now for the central involvement of this oral phase, the area is obviously the facial area of Brodmann's area 4 to carry the commands down through the cortical bulbar tract, and the Brodmann's area 44, 45 to essentially smooth out the pattern of commands to do everything that you do orally. It's all under your voluntary control, just like speech is. Brodmann's area 44, 45 on the dominant side is involved in speech production and swallowing. And in the non-dominant hemisphere, it's involved in swallowing. So there does appear to be a little bit of hemispheric specialization in Brodmann's area 44, 45 for swallowing, but not nearly as much as for speech. And the evidence for that was, well, let me talk about speech first. If you have a stroke in the Brodmann's area 44, 45 on the non-dominant side of your brain, you won't have an apraxia of speech. You won't lose speech. You may have a dysarthria, but not too bad, and you won't lose speech. If it's on the dominant side, on the other hand, you will lose speech. If it's a big stroke in Brodmann's area 44, 45, you'll have a severe verbal apraxia and possibly a complete loss of speech, although you may retain perceptive language to some degree. Now for swallowing, let's go to swallowing. It's a swallowing course after all. There is a tendency to have a little more oral involvement in swallowing, oral impairment in swallowing, with a lesion that involves Brodmann's area 44, 45 on the non-dominant hemisphere, or in the non-dominant hemisphere. In other words, it's exactly this opposite laterality. But the key difference is not to the same degree. In other words, you lose speech if you lose Brodmann's area 44, 45 on the dominant hemisphere. But that you will not lose speech. You'll have oral control of the swallowing. You'll have an impairment for oral control of the swallowing if there's a lesion on the non-dominant side. Hope that makes sense. We'll discuss it more in our discussion, but that's basically the overview. Okay, now we finished the central part of swallowing control. Let's look at the peripheral nervous system as it is involved in swallowing. And I'm going to go through the 3 different phases of swallowing, the main phases: oral phase, pharyngeal phase, and esophageal phase, and divide each into the sensory and motor, and then go through what cranial nerves are involved in each one of them. And so looking first at the oral phase, sensation from the lips all the way back to the oropharyngeal port is controlled by branches of the fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve. The upper portions of your oral cavity are subserved for sensation by the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve, and that's for fine touch, proprioception, and kinesthesia. So it's everything. It's not just out here. You know that depiction of the territories of the three branches of the trigeminal nerve that shows the side of a face and shows how the ophthalmic division subserves this area, the maxillary division subserves this area, and the mandibular division subserves this area. That's true, but it's not just the surface. It's all the way in. In other words, if you get a cold and your maxillary sinuses are congested and you feel it, you feel a pressure. What's carrying that information back? The maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. It's the whole wedge of tissue, not just the surface of the face. And so including in that whole wedge of tissue, if you're talking about the maxillary division, it's the roof of the mouth. It's the upper teeth, it's the upper lip, it's everything. Back to the end of the velum, the edge, the back edge of the velum. Then the lower portions of the oral cavity are subserved by the mandibular division, again, for those three modalities, fine touch, proprioception, and kinesthesia. So what portions are we talking about? Lower lip, lower buccal cavity, under the tongue, surface of the tongue, back to that boundary between the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Once you get through that oral pharyngeal port, you're into the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and then sensation and all afferent functions are going to be dominated by the glossopharyngeal nerve. So this is just the floor of the mouth that's subserved for fine touch, proprioception, pain, and temperature by the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. Now, for taste, which is after all part of swallowing, it helps if you taste it, what you're preparing orally. The anterior 2/3 of the tongue is subserved for taste by the facial nerve, a branch of the facial nerve. And the visceral afferent neurons travel with the somatic afferent neurons with the lingual branch of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. In other words, those two parts of your afferent system, one for taste, which is visceral, and one for tactile, which is somatic, are carried by the same nerves. Different separate neurons combined into this, the same nerve, and what nerve? The lingual nerve. So the lingual nerve is a branch of the mandibular division of 5, but it does carry not just information for fine touch, proprioception, and pain and temperature, but for taste as well. And those neurons that are going to subserve taste go to a different cranial nerve nucleus, or cranial nucleus, I should say. Now, I'm not sure how much of that you already know from your neuro course. And so I'm going to leave it there and not try to explain more. And then when we get together for our synchronous session, we'll delve into that as much as you need to make sure that you understand that part. Okay, now for the motor functions of the oral phase of swallowing, the facial nerve subserves all the muscles of facial expression. Now, how are the muscles of facial expression involved in swallowing? Well, when you talk about acceptance, you've got to be able to purse the lips and secure them onto the edge of a cup or onto a straw. So there's that part. Remember, you need muscle tone in order to keep the buccal cavities from filling up as you do oral preparation. So that part. So lip control and maintenance of tone of the facial muscles. The mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve controls the muscles of mastication, the chewing muscles. And we will go through, I'm going to actually give you some problems to see where you're at with that and to help you to understand that more fully when we have our synchronous session. And then the hypoglossal nerve subserves the lingual muscles. So obviously tongue control is very important, and that's subserved by the glossopharyngeal nerve, or excuse me, by the hypoglossal nerve. So you've got 3 cranial nerves involved in the oral phase of swallow as far as muscular function goes. And you've got the 2 branches of the trigeminal nerve involved in sensory functions, and then some neurons that subserve taste from the 7th cranial nerve. All right. Now, this has to do with the peripheral nervous system for the pharyngeal phase. In some ways, I kind of think this is easier than what we just went through for the oral phase. There are just fewer nerves involved, basically. Now, this let's do the afferent functions first. It's 1 cranial nerve. All afferent functions posterior to the oropharyngeal port are subserved by the glossopharyngeal nerve. So that's all the way down to the UES, upper esophageal sphincter. And where's that nerve carrying the information that it picks up? To the nucleus solitarius. So going back to our last lecture where we talked about the steps involved in the normal swallow, remember oral transfer, and you push the head of the bolus through the oropharyngeal port, and then all these things start happening. Why do they happen? Because once the head of the bolus passes through the oropharyngeal port, it's sending afferent signals through the glossopharyngeal nerve to the nucleus solitarius, which kicks off that whole series of motor commands that go to the muscles involved in the pharyngeal and upper esophageal phases. Now, the motor functions for the pharyngeal phase include velar and pharyngeal muscles, all the intrinsic laryngeal muscles that are involved in closure of the larynx, and those are all innervated by branches of the vagus nerve. And all of the neurons that are carrying that kind of information are referred to as branchial efferent neurons. I'm not sure if you're accustomed to using that term branchial, and we've also used somatic, and I've also used visceral. I'm not sure about where you are on that. It should be in 474 or your neuro course, but sometimes it's not. And so we will go over that as much as needed to make sure that you have an understanding of what I mean by branchial efferent neurons. But those are neurons that are going to come from, in this case, the nucleus ambiguus, and they're going to go to the muscles of the pharynx and the larynx, and the upper esophagus too, for that matter. Okay. All right, so the afferent functions are subserved by branches of the vagus nerve traveling back to the nucleus solitarius. That is wrong. It's branches of the glossopharyngeal nerve, and I will correct that on the slide so that by the time you've got your slides, that it's going to say afferent functions are subserved by branches of the glossopharyngeal nerve traveling back to nucleus solitarius. Efferent functions for the esophageal phase are subserved by branches of the vagus nerve traveling from the nucleus ambiguus for the upper third of the esophagus, and from the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve for the lower 1/3 of the esophagus. Now that's new. I haven't mentioned that nucleus before. It's in the medulla, and it's a muscle that's involved in digestive processes. It's actually a big nucleus, and it sends through the vagus nerve down to all the smooth muscles of your digestive system, like to make your intestines contract and do all that stuff. It's all vagus nerve from this particular nucleus, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. How does it get involved in swallowing? Well, we do include esophagus in the swallowing process, and the lower third of the esophagus is actually made up of smooth muscles, much like your intestines, the same type of muscle tissue, and those are subserved by a different set of neurons referred to as visceral efferent. Here's the little VE. Visceral has to do with vegetative processes, not with voluntary motor movement. And so that's the lower third. So lower third of the esophagus is smooth muscles controlled by a different nucleus, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. Upper third is controlled by they're striated muscles, just like all the muscles that we swallow with, controlled by the nucleus ambiguous. And then the middle third, we've left that out, is a mixture of the two types. So, so that's my last point is both nucleus ambiguous and dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve subserve the middle third. It's a mixture of smooth muscles and striated muscles. Smooth muscles are innervated by visceral efferent neurons, and striated muscles throughout this whole system that we've talked about are innervated by branchial efferent neurons. And that is the end. We surely will have a question and answer period that will be a little more extensive because just depending upon what your background is in neuro, to help make sure that you have a good understanding of what we just went through. And we'll have problem solving starting already, and including some problems that I will give you in advance, and then some problems that we'll develop as we go through it. All right, so I'll stop sharing my screen and I'm going to end.